Hello, well today's video is kind of appropriate when you consider recent announcements of France's new carrier being named after the Free French forces of World War II, that we're looking at what their destroyers did in World War II. We're looking at the French destroyers. Now, I do have to apologise quickly, BT are actually outside my house installing full-fat fibre optic. They haven't yet reached the house, but now the cable's actually being put down the road. So, you know, who knows, soon I might get full-fat fibre. We never know. But the good thing is, that means there's noise. The bad thing is, I have to do this recording today because I have to get everything done. Because I've got a very busy weekend and I want to make sure this is all done beforehand. So I'm apologising for the lighting and the noise occasionally outside. Now, the French Navy of World War II is constantly trying to achieve what it thinks it should achieve. You have to remember, for it is one of the great navies of the world. And it truly is one of the great navies of the world. And they have the mental image of that, and they have the reality of that. But then they have the reality that the Free French do not have access to the full capabilities of the French Navy. And when they get equipment, it's not always at the same time. And they don't always have all these wonderful pieces of these wonderful ships all at the same time. There's also the fact that the warfare their ships had been designed for was not necessarily the war they found themselves fighting. This didn't necessarily make them unviable for it. In fact, some of them were very, very good designs for it, especially their large destroyers. In fact, when people tend to ask me what the Royal Navy missed most about the French not being involved in a large chunk of World War II, it's their large destroyers are usually put up higher than anything else, because French large destroyers are something which is a really useful capability. They are the closest capability the Allies had to the Libre class in the Atlantic and Mediterranean regions. And they were really, really, really useful ships when they were available. But it's when you have them. So we're going to talk through, and we're going to quickly discuss the concept of the classes in this video, and then we're going to talk about what the ships what ships they had available actually did. And we're not going to go too much detail about the concepts, because at some point we're going to do the interwar French Navy. And I've done videos about interwar French naval aviation, I've done videos about various doctrines of the French during interwar, but I want to do a whole video, and it's going to come up later this year, on the French interwar doctrine, that's 1918 to 1939 doctrine of destroyers, or contre-torpilleurs and torpilleur d'escadre. Now, these vessels are beautiful, and they are designed to work together as part of a whole fleet structure. The French are very much building a task group, task force structure. They are the only other navy really going down that route immediately after World War I. The first navy going down that route is the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy has been moving towards that route almost immediately, because they kind of realise, hang on, any war we find ourselves fighting in the future, we are not going to require our full fleet to fight unless we're against the Americans, as they're the only ones who are likely to build up to something equivalent to our strength. So therefore, what we're going to be dealing with is a task group structure. We're going to be operating in task groups. And if you look at the Royal Navy's approach to war versus Japan, etc., all these things, they were all about task groups. They were all about mixed groups of carriers and battleships or fast capital ships and cruisers and destroyers, and that's how the force structure they were looking at. And that's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy is so obsessed with cruiser numbers, because they realised that to make their task groups work, they need cruisers. The French also realise this, but the French go earlier than the British. They go, hang on, we've not got enough cruisers. Okay, can we make this work with large, fast destroyers? And that's the contre-torpilleurs. They are scouts, they are basically the musclemen of the destroyer force. They are 2,000 plus tons in their stand displacement, which means they are heavier than a Libre class destroyer, and they are a lot earlier. They are 1920s. So that's what these ships are. These are the big muscle destroyers of the French force. There are later ones which are quite honestly being built with the idea of taking on the small Condottieri class style sort of cruisers of the Italian Navy and smashing them up, which is actually something in World War II the Libre class destroyers like to do. And it kind of makes you think of how much more deadly would it have been for the Italian fleet, for the Regia Marina, if the French destroyers, which are actually designed to do it, rather than the Royal Navy destroyers, which were the closest to them, were actually involved in those operations. Because the big French destroyers, they were basically built to take out those cruisers. With that being said, the Chacal class are this really early class of contre-torpilleurs. They are a really good-looking class. They have lovely lines. They do have some issues, but let's be honest, they are mildly experimental, but most good things start out as mildly experimental. The thing is, though, what they are is capable. And the Free French managed to get two. Two of them. The Leopard and a Tigre. And we're going to talk first about the Leopard. Now, Leopard had had quite a career before even World War II began. She spent most of the time with the 2nd Squadron, based at Brest, the second sort of destroyer squadron. Usually working with Chacal, Lynx and Jaguar, tending to wandering around those sort of duties. Eventually, in 1935, she's transferred along with Chacal to the Naval School, the École Naval at Brest. And eventually, though, the 8th Destroyer Division, which is basically a squadron, which is what is redesignated as the 2nd large destroyer division, or the Division des contre-torpilleurs, the 2nd. And, it's a good unit. Again, Jaguar joins her and Chacal and that. She'd had her 75mm guns replaced by some twin, 4 of them, 13.2mm anti-aircraft machine gun mounts, which I'm sure they felt was an upgrade. I'm sure they all felt was an upgrade, and I realise it's not just France, it's other nations are doing something similar at the point, but you can't help but with a slight bit of hindsight looking back go, so you replaced a 3-inch rapid-firing gun with some machine guns? Yes. Were you planning on the aircraft getting within spitting range? But we'll leave that to one side. We will leave that to one side. That's what they did. But no, she's a good ship. In fact, she starts off automatically 1939 doing things. She gets even Aztec installed early on in 1940, along with depth charges being reinstalled. They've been taken off. But, it's nice to have them. But her 1939 formations, well, she spends quite a lot of time assigned to Western Maritime Forces Command. And she's then put under Admiral Abril in May 1940. And she goes into various tasking, supporting Dunkirk, supporting Cherbourg, providing defence of Cherbourg, providing fire plans on German advancing forces. Often working with Chacal, they would be used to sort of lead forces of Torpilleur Escarra, lighter destroyers, and eventually they're put under a whole separate force, which is commanded by an admiral operating from an aviso, which is a French equivalent to a sloop, really. But it makes sense because the sloops avisos have more space for an admiral's staff, is often used as an admiral's yacht, than most destroyers will. This is the big difference between the large French destroyers and the British large destroyers, in that they don't have really space for an admiral's staff aboard. I'm not saying the British destroyers have a lot of space for it, but they do have some space made for them to be used in that function for their cruising role. And she's dutiful. She's actually one of the ships which fires the last shots in the battle around Boulogne-sur-Mer on the 24th of May, when the Germans are trying to advance and trying to push back towards the ports. She does a lot of very critical little missions. And she's critical in the evacuation of Dunkirk and in all the operations going on there. At one point, she rescues 19 soldiers, British ones principally, whose boat has basically been damaged and is sinking, and they deliver them to England. They get to the UK. But this can't go on forever. And with France falling finds her in Portsmouth. And this is why she's one of the first vessels to be available that she is secured by Operation Catapult. And then she's handed quickly over to the Free French. And they give her command to Lieutenant de Vasseur. That's about lieutenant commander sort of equivalent. Senior lieutenant, junior lieutenant commander sort of rank. It basically means fleet lieutenant. but Lieutenant de Vassou, basically Lieutenant of the ship of the line, Jules Evenou, who, because of the reasons of the French forces when they're operating under the Free French, to protect their families, they often take on nom de guerres, and his was Jacques Richard, which is quite a cool one. And then she goes and serves with the Free French, and she has a very active history with the Free French. Now this vessel was with the Free French, the British turned around and went, would you like a bit of an upgrade in terms of your AA defence? Are you really wedded to those 13.2mm guns? And the French went, no, we're not. And honestly, if we still had access to our own infrastructure, we'd be getting rid of them toot sweet. And so she has two, which are two of the after ones replaced with a 4-inch gun, which is mounted between the funnels. And she has the forward to move further up the superstructure, and then she gains two of the 40mm pom-poms, 2-pounders, forward of that. And after she's had these modifications, the upgrade, she goes on to Western Approaches Command. She goes to Convoy Escort. And she has some quite good success there. She even saves a few people from a sunk vessel. She just, 39, I think, of the crew are saved by her. And she's really, really useful. And there is a lovely account of Jules Evenou, or rather, Jacques Richard, which you can go and find on the Wayback Machine. I can't actually find its version now, but I could find it on the Wayback Machine when I went and did some research for him. And he was basically able to save 39 survivors from this cargo vessel, and then led 5 what are described in the article as grenade attacks, but I'm presuming are depth charge attacks on a German submarine, which probably sunk it. I'd say it's more likely to be depth charges than grenades, and I think it's probably the translation of the French on the Wayback Machine to English. And when I've tried to get the English version of the original French version to my own translation, the Wayback Machine hasn't cooperated. So this is the trouble sometimes using these articles to try and track down stuff. Digital archive articles are a bit fun that way. But no, it does really, really well, and she carries on doing well. She then has a longer conversion to becoming what is theoretically an escort destroyer. Her forward boiler and funnel are removed, and they're given extra oil storage, extra fuel and accommodation for ratings. This takes her top speed down to 31.5 knots, but increases her fuel range to, a pretty decent 4,200 nautical miles at 15 knots, and allows her to take a maximum 234 crew. They also, how do I put this, reorientate her depth charge system, because, the chutes were not proving that great, and they put in rails instead. But this also allows her to store larger, heavier depth charges. Again, this is useful. This is an additional system. She gets some throwers. She gets all sorts of systems put in. The 4-inch gun at this point is now replaced by Oricons, AA guns, and they add on more pom-poms as well. So basically they are increasing what I would call the medium to light AA rather than the heavy AA. And this is useful for her. Why is it useful? It's giving her increased AA armament. But more importantly, it allows her top weight space to take a Type 291 search radar. And that allows her to become really very useful. Then we have ongoing operations after that, in escort operations, and she again engages submarines on several occasions. But really the highlight of her career as part of the Free French is going to be the liberation of La Réunion, or rather the Battle of Réunion, as it's sometimes discussed, in November 1942. Where she arrives off this small island with 80 soldiers aboard. They land, they manage to take control of St. Denis, which was the capital, and the governor fled into the interior. There was a small fight with a coastal defense battery, but the contre-torpilleur, the lovely Leopard, fires back, And there were, sadly enough, men killed on both sides, but yeah, they managed to get the island to surrender on the 30th. After that point, she spent her time patrolling the Indian Ocean until March 1943. Now, Tigre had started a war, like most of her colleagues, doing escort operations. In November 1939, she's actually fitted with British Aztec, which is really kind of helpful. Unfortunately, she is in Mers el Kabir when France concedes, when France... Honestly, their government collapses before the people of the army does, so the French government collapses in 1940. And she actually escapes Mers el Kabir, and she goes to Toulon. And when Toulon is occupied, she is one of the ships captured pretty much intact by the Germans. She's turned over to the Italians. The Regia Marina designate her with a new number, FR23, and they commission her. After Pierre Laval agrees to her transfer, and she goes to Taranto, and they use her as a transport. They don't actually really use her as a warship. Italy surrenders itself, of course, in September 1943. And at this point, she's turned over to the Free French. And they take custody of her in Bizet, North Africa, in October 1943. She's recommissioned in December, but repairs take a long time. She's not in service back again until March 1944. And so she really hasn't had a good war. She was a capable asset, she was a very useful asset, and she was taken off the board quite early. She had briefly engaged HMS Wrestler, and it was her and Lynx who actually engaged it, and they also depth charged HMS Proteus, a submarine, as they'd escaped from Mers el Kabir. But yeah, they were not treated well by the French, the Vichy French, who had reduced them to reserve and stripped them of all their armament, and they were not treated well. Well, she wasn't by the Italians, and then when the Free French get her, well, they do the best they can with her, but she's in a bad state. They managed to get her some Oerlikons added on, some 20mm. She takes part in convoy escorting. She's damaged at one point by near misses in 1944. And then, whilst she's in Iran, she gets one of those sort of escort refits where she loses her forward funnel and boiler, and she has oil tanks added in. And, this is useful. Additional accommodation as well comes as part of that. And she gets the depth charges replaced, all things. Basically, a similar workout as what Leopard got. But, it's not really the same, and it's a bit late. She provided support for Flank Force, which was part of the naval gunfire operations for Allied forces landing in the Italian and French border, and protecting against German attacks in Genoa, La Spezia, that sort of area. She ends up back in Toulon by the end of the war. And that's it. That's her World War II. She carries on serving. She's providing ferry for troops, supporting French forces in Algeria, and then uses a gunnery training ship for a while. And later an engineering school ship. But this was a ship which was never allowed to really fly. It's rather sad in a way. She's a good ship, but the reason I picked out these two to show is you've got Leopard, which has an incredibly active but short career, and you have Tigre, which has a very long career but doesn't really get to do much. They're both good ships. They just don't get the same opportunities. Then we go on to the Fantasque Class. Now, the Le Fantasque Class are, in the words of one of my little cousins, she has told me that this is the most accurate word to use to describe them, are some of the fattest destroyers, that's P-H-A-T-E-S-T, ever built. I think that means beautiful. That's what she told me anyway. And I'm sure my little cousin wouldn't lie to me. She'd never lie about these things. Anyway, They are really, really good vessels, and they're basically built to go toe-to-toe with the Condottieri. And the reason they're built like that is that the Italians and the French have gone two sides of the same coin. It's, do you go for large destroyers or very small cruisers to try and get a high-speed combat vessel? And the French have gone for very large destroyers. And these ones come in at nearly 2,600 tons in standard. Very close to 2,600 tons in standard. It's either 2,569. There are some others which edge up slightly closer to 2,600 tons. Deep load, roughly 3,400 tons. They are big, powerful destroyers. 5.5-inch guns. They are really starting to look like cruisers, but the thing is, they have a stability profile which allows them to actually work with their guns. They still don't get a very good, impressive rate of fire from them. But to be fair, they have official top speed of 37 knots. They have a trial top speed of 45 knots for some of them, and some others achieved very close to 45 knots when they were actually on war operations. These things are fast. They are nasty and they are fast. And they're coming in armed with 9 torpedoes, ready to go in three triple arrangements. They are armed with those 5.5-inch guns. They've got some 37mm AA guns. They've got some of those twin 13.2mm AA guns. They have a crew of 265 in wartime conditions. You know, they are big, powerful destroyers. Big and powerful. Unfortunately, their principal guns are low angle, but they can only go up to plus 30. But let's be honest, they're 5.5-inch guns. You're not going to get much higher from it. And in the sort of the scenario you're talking about, if you wanted to have them have a higher angle than that, you're going to have to give them a lot of space. A lot of space for their mounts. And they carried 200 rounds plus 75 star shells per gun. So 75 star shells overall and 200 per gun. So that's 1,000 rounds of ammunition for the 5.5-inch. There again, as said, they don't really have the highest rate of fire. This class are the last of the contre-torpilleurs to be fully built before war begins. The Mogadors which come off them, there's only 2 of those. There's only 2. They don't really get enough of them into the water. This class is completed. All 6 are completed. And at this point, I'd be hoping to talk about how useful they were in World War II and how much they got up to. But again, it's rather like the previous class we talked about. It's rather like the Chacals. The trouble is, for them, is where are they when war begins? What are they doing? That affects how much they get to do and what they get to do as part of the force. With that, let's talk about Le Triomphant. One of my favourites. One of my favourites as a class, definitely. A Triumphant's wharf service would include all sorts of interesting things. At this point, she'd actually have a British radar added in by an American yard. She had Aztec, she had all sorts of modifications done. But she very nearly didn't. She's part of the Force to Raid, she's operating on Mesa Kabir, and she actually takes part in an operation which is to go and try and intercept German merchant vessels heading for Norway. And these operations up there, up in the North Sea. And she gets damaged. Probably by the sea more than the actual engagement. They end up fighting a couple of torpedo boats. It doesn't really cause them much damage. But what happens is she ends up developing engine issues. And so she has to stop off in Plymouth. And so she's in Plymouth for repairs when there is the actual operations going on in the Fall of France. And so she sees as part of Operation Catapult again. And she is quickly turned over to the Free French Navy. She really is. She is something they are really keen on getting hold of because she is a very useful ship. She's pretty much the largest vessel they actually have access to in the early part of the war, that they actually consider a viable warship for modern operations. But she is kind of like a Tribal class destroyer. She has constant turbinitis. It's described as machinery problems, but actually when you read its description and you look at it and you look at the description of turbinitis from the Tribal class, you start to realize, hang on, what's going on here? It's because the vessels are larger than most other destroyers, so they can go through the seas, but they're still using destroyer machinery, which takes damage from all the repeated hitting on the ship of actually pushing through the heavy seas. And this causes the turbine blades to become unseated and unsettled, and it's a constant issue. It's an ongoing issue for these ships. If you're using ships which are roughly below 3,000 tons in stand displacement, roughly sort of that category, at full speed, in heavy seas for long periods of time, that will cause a build-up of issues equivalent to turbinitis. And it's actually one of the reasons why today when we're talking about the price points of size of ships, when you're starting to go, okay, I want a vessel which is going to operate at high speed for long periods of time, and rather than just the cruising speed, you're usually looking at something which is on the sort of the 6,000 ton scale at the moment in most Western navies. Because it's large enough, and you can put in large enough gearing systems that they're going to be able to take the damage, they're going to be able to take the constant strain. Her wartime service included things like going through the Panama Canal and revealing that there is a Japanese observer watching every ship going through that because she's so accurately reported. Touring around French Polynesia, British Fiji and other islands in the Pacific and basically going, hello, we're protecting this for the Free French. Getting damaged while on passage between New Zealand to Sydney and ending up having to do maintenance in Sydney. Then going on to do some evacuations as well as escort duties before eventually managing to get ourselves into what was a very long-term refit in Garden Island Dockyard in Sydney. It lasted from March 1942 to January 1943, and literally it's because of spare parts. It's because they're dealing with a whole load of French machinery that they don't have equipment for and they have to rebuild. So while the Japanese are marching on, attacking everywhere, you've got this ship, which is this very useful ship, which is just sitting there not being able to be used. Even when she does get back into duties, and she's often assigned escort duties and supporting things like the shipping iron ore routes, etc., she runs into trouble. She runs into so much trouble because it's bureaucratic. No one's quite sure what to call her, because the Americans are insisting, that ship is not a destroyer. The French are going, it is a destroyer. The Americans are going, no, it's not. And eventually, after having had another refit in Sydney between September and November 1943, she is reclassified as a light cruiser. Technically, there is an argument that she's classified as a light cruiser while she's in the middle of the refit, but realistically, no one takes any notice of it from the French, and the only point it actually manages to be pushed is when she comes out from the refit, and they start treating her to an extent as a light cruiser. However, very quickly, they are managing to get a sense somewhere where she will not be treated as a light cruiser. So she takes on a Royal Australian Navy liaison team, and takes part, starts doing missions towards the Mediterranean, supporting an American oil tank on the way across. Unfortunately, she was damaged en route. And so the tanker ends up having to tow her. And then she's stuck by a typhoon, and she's even more damaged at that point. And eventually they manage to get her further along, and she's supported by HMS Frobisher, one of those lovely old Hawkins class cruisers of the Royal Navy that set all the problems off of the treaty limits, but we'll leave that to one side. And she's taken to Duegas in French Madagascar. There they carry out some temporary repairs, but at least they do have the same operating language as all their manuals, which does help. And then she's taken to Boston, Massachusetts for longer repairs, which means she's there for about a year, until April 1945. Then she's transferred to the Indian Ocean in 1945, and, well, she serves with the Eastern Fleet of the Royal Navy for quite a while. But pretty much her war spends most of the time in refit. Every time she comes out, she's useful. She's really useful. But she has to spend a lot of time being maintained, being repaired, to be kept in service. But she does a good job. She does. Shameless book plug time. So this is the point where I say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, supporting the channel, helping grow, and make a shameless plug my book. More are coming soon. I know I keep saying that, but honestly, it'll be... He says, crossing fingers, eventually when the house is done and everything, and I stop having BT digging up the road outside my house, and the electric's going, and the plumbing going, and the water going, and everything else going, yes, I will actually manage to get the books and things out that I want to get out that I'm working on. I do apologise, though. I do apologise. It is a bit of a nightmare, and it's all made a lot easier by your kindness and your support, but it all takes time, and there's only so much time you have. And that's the problem. Everything takes time. It's the one thing you cannot replace, you cannot compensate for in other areas. Time comes, time goes, and that's time spent and can't be recovered. It's a shame, really, but we're getting there. We're getting there. Anyway, with that being said, on to La Terrible. La Terrible's war starts out very similar to her sister. She's part of Force de Raid. She starts off at Brest, and then she moves down eventually to Mezzo-Kabir. She is part of the operations going on that the French are doing. And this is one of the things that's often misunderstood about the French at the beginning of the war. They are heavily involved in the naval campaign. They're off hunting down the Admiral Graf Spee. They're off doing operations all up and down the Atlantic. And she's part of the force, as I said, at Mezzo-Kabir. She is part of the force that exits the harbour when it's attacked by the British after the French government concedes. And she engages with Royal Navy destroyers as part of the escort of Strasbourg back to Toulon. Now, one of the interesting things, though, is she's not in Toulon when the Germans decide to seize the ship. She's actually back at Mezzo-Kabir. And she is back at Mezzo-Kabir after having refits, etc., as part of maintaining the force there. What's interesting is because she's been quite well maintained, she has been quite well maintained by the Vichy French government. When the Allies do invade North Africa in Operation Torch, and she and La Fantasque join the Allies, the Free French are really happy. Really happy. They managed to get her Aztec system upgraded. They managed to get all sorts of radar systems, upgraded. Her AA armament upgraded. But she's a really good ship for them to get hold of because she's in pretty good condition. She's not been that heavily used. She's been well maintained. So she's a really useful vessel for them to acquire. And she starts off by going right after the West Indies. She goes to visit Martinique. She goes to Algeria. She's sailing it around, being part of the Allied war effort. She's part of the forces which land personnel on Corsica, for example. She is a really useful asset. But, and I do mean this in a serious term, again, there is a debate as to whether she's a destroyer or a light cruiser. Again, along with her sisters, quite a lot of them are technically reclassified to light cruisers. Because they are so big, so powerful, they must be a light cruiser. They are a large destroyer. They're a contre-torpilleur. They are where I honestly think the large destroyers would have come out if there hadn't been for the treaty system. I think large destroyers like this would have become quite a normal thing. I think you'd have had two developments of destroyer line. Because it kind of fits with what you end up with post-World War II as sort of destroyer and frigate line. And does kind of fit with what the sloop duties were sort of developing into. And basically, sloop duties / small destroyer duties are to an extent interchangeable. It's just the small destroyers have torpedoes. And large destroyers are building up to almost replace some of the light cruiser roles. And filling in those missions which allow cruisers to grow up and fill up sort of other more senior roles up above. It's one of the realities of the treaty system it forces us about. By stopping you building vessels at the top of the line, capital ships and carriers, quite early on, you force the other ships to grow to fulfill those missions and those roles. Because they need space to do that. She just managed to sink a few ships while service of the Allies. She managed to do quite a lot of work when she's given the opportunity. And she is, as I keep emphasizing, a useful asset. It's one of those things when you sit there and look at her and go, okay, surely you could be used for more. Well, the trouble is, it's when they get her. They finally get her in 1943. And if you think about the Battle of Atlantic, if you think about the Battle of the Mediterranean, 1943 is where it's sort of past its peak and it's going down. It's getting easier. Victory is becoming more and more assured. And you don't want to send her too far away. You don't want to send her off to the Far East because, frankly, you're having enough trouble supporting the assets you have out there. Again, you don't have access to the French logistics system. In North Africa, that sort of area, you've actually taken over some of the French logistics system because of their bases and etc., which were there. So you've got some ability to support their vessels with some of their domestic logistics, which is a far better fit than anything you can manufacture. So she's staying in the Atlantic area. She's useful. She's taking over duties which otherwise would have had to be done by someone else, and other ships, which means they can be off elsewhere. But she doesn't really get the chance to shine. She doesn't get the operations which could allow her to really shine. And that takes us to the Bourrasque Class. So you can't have the contre-torpilleur without the torpilleur d'escadre. They are the two different styles of destroyer which the French were pursuing. And the torpilleur d'escadre are sometimes called fleet torpedo boats. They are sometimes derided in some regards. I don't know why. They make perfect sense to me. You have your large destroyer for doing large destroyer duties, and you have your small destroyer and your avisos. And the avisos sort of between the two and are basically the French equivalent of a sloop, really. You have your for your escort duties, for your number duties, and they build 12 of these. 12. The Bourrasque Class are really quite cute ships. They're armed with 4 to 5-inch guns. They've got super firing each end. They carry 6 torpedoes. There's nothing wrong with them. For roughly 1,300 tons in standard, they are a very decent build of destroyer. They really are. They're nothing that you're going to run home about shouting and screaming, going, "Wow, this is amazing!" But that's not what you always want. One of the problems we have today, I would say, is that we're always looking for the top trumps of a ship. When, realistically, quite a lot of the ships you want in your force are going to be ones which are good, solid designs that are going to deliver on exactly what you need from a destroyer. You need fairly high speed. It can do 33 knots. You need it to be have a fairly decent range. 2,000 nautical miles at 14 knots. It's quite good. You need it to be fairly heavy hitting with torpedoes. It's carrying 6. You've got to need to have a good all-round armament. It's got 4 5-inch guns. It's got some 37mm air guns. It's got the 13.2mm machine guns, which are a choice. They maybe make more sense in the late 1920s, early 1920s. It's this class which are actually the basis for the Vickers class, which are built for the Polish Navy. They are good-looking ships. They are capable ships. They are, I would argue, more similar to the Royal Navy's W class than anything else in sort of the French Navy preceding them, but they are still a very good vessel. And honestly, basing off the British W class, it's not a bad idea. That's a very solid class for the end of World War I era, for the 1921 and 20s era. That is a very solid class to go for. You've gone looked at across your way and gone, they built dozens of those things, and they seem to be doing a pretty good job. Let's use that as an idea of, we're not designing something which is going to be the world, setting the world on fire. That's why we have the Chevals, that's why we have the other destroyers, the big contre-torpilleurs for. This is not what we have these for. And they're really useful. So, there are a couple of these we're going to talk about. And then we're going to get onto Le Droits. And I have selected vessels which were of value in World War II, which were used by the Free French forces. Not every single one of their destroyers, of course, because some of them have very similar paths of they basically are in Mezzo Kabir for a few years or something like that, and then they're liberated and they are handed over to the Free French. But to give you a good example of what the Free French forces, what the French Navy was up to in World War II. So with them being such solid destroyers, you'd expect this ship to have a really, standard usage history. Well, she doesn't. She has quite a fun one. You see, she had already got damaged, and it was engine repairs again. Often happens to destroyers in this time period. And so the Royal Navy say, okay, we'll tow her out the way. We'll get her from Brest, we'll get her to somewhere safe where she can be repaired. They tow her to Devonport, Plymouth. And repairs are completed. But the thing is, there isn't really a crew aboard her. And when the British do, the phrase is commandeer, Operation Catapult, basically going, hang on, there are French assets now sitting in our harbours, which technically are a country which is under occupation by the Germans and have technically surrendered. What's happening with those warships? If someone goes nuts, there could be problems here. It's one of the things of, again, there was not enough thought put into worst-case scenarios in Allied planning. There really wasn't, because none of that was organised beforehand. Admittedly, though, with the way the French government decided to collapse and kept disagreeing with itself and arguing with itself and changing its mind every 5 minutes, depending on who was actually talking to you, I'm not sure if it would have helped if there had been the pre-planning. No one expected the French government to collapse like it did. And it was, as I keep emphasising in the videos whenever I do on the subject, far more of a French government collapse than the French army or the France as a nation. And to me, it's a good lesson in, as part of your war fighting, as part of your strategic preparedness, you need to think about government preparedness and government structures and how government is going to deal with these issues. And I don't think we do enough of that today. I really don't. I think that's a strong lesson from history which is forgotten, in that you need to prepare your government for the realities of war fighting and the realities and the complexities of these operations, and the fact that not everything's going to go your way. So many, and this is something which comes through constantly today in discussions today, is the belief that these things will automatically go your way. They won't. In this scenario, it leads to rather an interesting thing. She's transferred to the Polish Navy, the Free Polish Navy. And from the July 1940 to April 1941, she sails under a Polish ensign, using the designation Okręt Francuski, French ship. So, Okręt Francuski Urgan. And that she was given instead of the usual, ORP prefix, which was soundly used by the Polish Navy at that point. She was under command of Bourrasque, that's Lieutenant Commander Bourrasque, and most of the crew actually came from the Grom, which had been lost during the ongoing fighting around Narvik in May 1940. She took part in all sorts of operations, and escorts, raids, convoys, all sorts of things where she was a supporting factor in them. She suffered storm damage, which included a flooded engine, had to have all sorts of issues because her engines, again, spare parts were always an issue. And she spent nearly 200 days of her service time under repair. But out of the roughly 300 days she spent in Polish service. Then she's turned on back to the Free French forces, who actually pass her to the Royal Navy in 1943 because they can't keep her operational. And that's her service. Again, this one point of, you really wish when they were towing the ships across, and they didn't think about this at the time, but you really wish someone had thought, hang on, let's pack in as many spare parts as they can. And you thought it would have been some of the thought process of, we need to fix this ship, we're not sure what's wrong with it, we're sending it over there to get away from here because we can't fix it here in time, we therefore should put a load of spare parts on it. But they didn't, they sent the ship across. And that's, of course, the important thing. But without the spare parts, you can't keep the ship going. And again, this is the point about having plans for if things go really bad. You need to have these kind of ideas worked up and thought through. Now, Mistral, she has a slightly different career. Again, not much. She doesn't get to do much. And that all comes down to what happened to her at the beginning. When she is based at Brest and early in the war, she's under the command of Lieutenant Commander Guillaume Christophe Marie de Toulouse-Lautrec Montfort. Let me pronounce that again. It's a very long name, okay? Guillaume Christophe Marie Pons, Count of Toulouse-Lautrec Montfort. Let me get that right again. Guillaume Christophe Marie Pons, Count of Toulouse-Lautrec Montfort. I think I got that right. I think. It's a long name, okay? Protect me here. Bear with me. Be nice to me. It's a long name. Anyway, the ship took part in the evacuation of Dunkirk. It really held itself up. But when Operation Catapult takes place, Guillaume decides to scuttle his ship to prevent it being taken by the British. Unfortunately, it partially succeeds. It doesn't quite succeed. This is the trouble. He gets some points on there, but it doesn't get fully scuttled. So then it has to be repaired. And this explains perhaps what happens to her, because when she's repaired, instead of them giving her to a Free French crew, as they do with pretty much every other ship, it receives Royal Navy guns, because they have them available, and it needs to be regunned, and it's renamed HMS Mistral. Why? Because the British aren't sure they trust this one. Mistral has a history with the French of being a stubborn vessel, so the Royal Navy decides, okay, we'll take it ourselves for a bit. And also, they don't have that many Free French crew. And they would have hoped to take at least some people from the French crew who'd been aboard her. But after what had happened, they didn't trust any of them, for some reason. So she serves for quite a while, doing escort duty, until she has a collision with a Black Ranger, and one of a tanker doing duties. And then she has to take some more repairs. She finally gets returned to the Free French around about in time for Normandy. And it's during these operations she's actually damaged by coastal artillery from the Germans. And she is also declared a constructive total loss because of it. She's providing support to operations, and she gets caught. It's not good for her. She's a good ship, though. She was a good ship. And they were a good little class. But they didn't get to do much because they don't have, I would say, the same luck as some of the larger destroyers do. But still, Guillaume had done his best to make sure his ship didn't get taken by the British. Which I can both understand and also at the same point not quite sure about. Mainly because I don't think, from all I've read about him and all I've studied about him, despite me having trouble with his name because it's quite so long making sure I get the timbre right, and the amount of work he'd done with the Royal Navy and time he spent with the Royal Navy, I would have expected him to be more on the side of the Free French than to have wanted to go with Vichy. But he ends up being part of the Vichy forces. He's quite successful in that role, and he then is part of the reconstitution of the French Navy and after the war, and he's attached to liaison officer with the British Naval Forces in Germany in 1946. So he's a really interesting soul. Destroyer officers often are. They often are. And then we get to the Libre class. So a continuation of those torpilleurs d'escadre, the fleet destroyers. The stalwarts, the workhorses of the fleet destroyer force. The Libre class. They're good ships. They are very capable ships. In the case of Le Droit herself, and we'll be focusing on Basque and L'Ancien, but we'll talk about some of the other members of the class, they have some interesting careers. They're, again, roughly 1,400 tons fully loaded. They're, again, they fit in the whole criteria we talked about before. 6 torpedoes. Everything is fitted up much the same as the previous small torpedo, Torpilleur d'Escadre class. And they're useful ships. Now, in the case of Le Droit, well, she has some fun. And I have some fun trying to get her commander name correct, so please bear with me. At the beginning of World War II, she found herself under command of Lieutenant Commander Henry Dupin de Saint-Crier. Hopefully I got that right. Anyway, she's carrying out operations. She's assisting in the northern flank. She's trying to protect the forces that are operating along the coast. And she then takes part in the evacuation from Dunkirk, and she's carrying out all sorts of operations for that duty. She gets damaged by HE 111 bombers. And so the commander, Henry Dupin de Saint-Crier, runs Le Droit aground near Malles-les-Bassins. She's beached. Then, curiously enough, there is a massive explosion in her forward magazine, which all the crew members survive. All of them were in a safe spot when it happened, and there's a huge hole created in the hull and in the deck and towards the bow. So the ship is unusable, completely unusable. Now, I might be a suspicious soul, but I would say if you've got your ship stuck and you don't think it's going to be able to take off and you want to prevent the enemy having access to it, the large pile of explosives you have in a forward magazine would be a very attractive thing for putting your vessel out of action. I'm just suggesting that might be the case here. Just a potentiality to think about. Now, there are others to look at and consider as well when we're talking about this. There's Alcyon. Now, Alcyon, she's a good little vessel. She really is. But she takes part in various operations actually fighting for the Vichy French. She ends up fighting for them on their side at the Casablanca. And then it's only after she's been captured after that operation, after the Vichy French in North Africa capitulate, transfers to the Allies, however you want to phrase it, she receives a modernization and carries on fighting with the Allies until she's finally withdrawn from service in 1948. She's a useful little vessel, wandering around and doing quite a lot of duties. But again, it's what you can do with a solid destroyer. It's what you can do. Basque, well, she has a similar experience, in that Basque is one of those vessels which are in Alexandria when Operation Catapult has to take place. She doesn't get scuttled. She's caught, she's captured, and they rejoin the Allied forces in July 1943. It's an important point when they do. There are some very useful assets, but again, the problem becomes when you start thinking about this is how useful those assets have been to have been fighting the war in the meantime. And you can go through the rest of this class. They all have an interesting wartime history, and this is one of the things which is worthwhile thinking of in terms of the French Navy in World War II. It's another of those big what-ifs, because if the French Navy en masse, the ones that weren't in France, the ones that could get away, had got away, had done a mass transfer to the Allies as France fell, taking as many troops and many people with them as they could, that would have been a major capability boost for the Allies. But, and this is the point you have to remember, for the Vichy French government, that would also have been a loss of a major asset in terms of what they were taking off the table, and what able to show them taking off the table, made it useful to the Axis powers. It's a tough situation to be in. It really is. Now, usually at this point, I would come up with a question and things for the end of the video, but that's not going to be the case, because whilst we have reached this point, and I can tell you that next week it's going to be the USN going forth to the world and their Cold War destroyers, we've not finished the video yet. And the reason we can't finish the video without talking about Libre is because despite being originally a Type 3 Hunt class destroyer called Holden, a good vessel, she has the best conversation of possibly the Free French forces in World War II aboard her. Because she'd been doing convoy duty for most of her service in World War II. She'd taken part in various fire support missions, and she at one point had run aground and had sent in Morse code. I am happy that a French ship be the first to touch the ground of France. This was during the Battle of Normandy, when she ran aground. She was a good and happy ship, and she had a good crew aboard her. She really did. André Patou, who was her commander, was a really good officer. But I couldn't finish the video without mentioning the conversation. And this is the conversation. When she's taking Charles de Gaulle and various other senior officers are on board in July 1944, Commander Patou, the captain, says, "I assume you wish to go to France, General." De Gaulle, "Did you not receive the orders?" Patou, "No, General, but it does not matter. We already know the way." At which point, an Admiral, D'Angelo, for some reason says, "Well, off to Normandy." And you sit there and go, they didn't care. They had a general coming aboard. They knew where they wanted him to take him. They knew where they needed to go. They weren't bothered. The critical thing, though, about that operation is they're being used to bring a 250 million franc fund. The reason they're taking that across is because the Free French government were very worried about the US occupation franc and it potentially destabilizing and undermining the French franc. And so they needed to get this vessel to France as quickly as possible, with all the senior people aboard it, with all the new francs, before the US occupation franc became the constant circulation currency. It was a lovely idea of the Americans, it really was, but for some reason, the French were worried. The French were worried that they, having their economy being a fake franc, a fake money note, as they decided, backed by dollars, was not good for long-term economic security. They're not wrong. It is a recipe for potentially hyperinflation, etc. As it would destroy the old franc currency and then require you completely reset the economy. So the Americans were using their occupation francs to try and pay for things as they were there. It's called occupation francs by the French. The US didn't call them that, of course. But the thing is, the French didn't want those to become the currency. They really didn't. So they had to get their own francs there, and that's what this vessel did. So she has a very active World War II, and in many ways, she shows what the Free French can do. She really does show what the Free French can do when they have a vessel which can be kept in well-maintained order. Unfortunately, she was mined on the 23rd of February 1945. And so she is sunk, and of her crew, only 118 are rescued. And they're rescued by a couple of MTVs. 67 are lost. For some reason, the Kriegsmarine felt the desire to claim that she'd been sunk by torpedoes. But the vessel which they claimed had sunk her had actually sunk a British cable layer. And yeah, we are certain she was sunk by mines. Possibly the airdrop variety. But there's a debate on that one. She was a good ship. She was a good ship. Now, with that all being said, let's finish this video off with a question we always do. So, I'd like you to think about this. We've talked about the French destroyers and the force they've got, and with that in mind, as I've said before, it would have been very useful if they could have been handed out, if they could have come over to the Allies. But they would have presented a logistical issue because of supporting and maintaining those ships when you don't have access to the domestic supply system and a logistics system. So what do you think? Do you think it would have been useful if the Free French forces had been bigger from the beginning and they'd had more vessels available? Or do you think it would have caused actually more trouble in the end? Or would, if you'd had larger Free French naval forces, would you have more likely got some parts of their sustainment infrastructure to make the job easier? Would you have got French North Africa, for example? I'd really love to hear what you think. Also, with the French destroyer designs, how do you think they would have been done if they'd had more of them, if they'd been able to use them as they were planned to be used? I'm going to be doing a video soon about the French interwar destroyers and their concepts behind them and the idea of how they're rebuilding their navy after World War One. But it'd be interesting to hear what you think from this video, because I tried to give a little bit of information about it, but not go too much because I don't want to spoil it for that video coming up, so I'm not repeating myself in that video. It's a fine line to walk, especially when I kept being interrupted every 5 minutes by loud, weird noises, and occasionally mispronouncing French names, especially when they're multi-barreled. Fun times. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. And if you like it, please do like, share, and subscribe. It does help the channel grow. Thank you.